Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering related topics. I'm your host, Sean Falconer, and today I'm joined by Murali Mani, former Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer at GeneDx, and we'll be talking about data privacy in healthcare. Murali, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited about this. I've been wanting to do sort of more shows focused on this particular topic around healthcare. Well, I'm sure we'll get into lots of different things today, but let's start off with the basics. Who are you and what do you do?
So, Sean, I've been in the healthcare industry for a long time. I started on the technical side in product development and research, and then moved into compliance and privacy. I've been in medical device companies, in AI technology companies, and most recently in genetic testing companies. I've built privacy programs from the ground up. I've also worked in very large companies where there's a global privacy program, and I was responsible for, let's say, for North America. So I've seen the large and the small. And I know some of the pain points in both types of companies.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. I feel like there is, clearly like a ton going on in this space right now. Especially, things like, at least that have been on my radar, is like all the work around generative AI and drug discovery and some of the innovation that's going on there. And so, it's a lot of really important and potentially impactful work. But of course, whenever we're talking about healthcare, drugs, genetics, any of these types of things, you're also going to end up inevitably kind of talking about, privacy, compliance, regulations, and that's going to be a big part of that conversation. So you mentioned you built privacy programs, from the ground up at some of these organizations. Typically, when does a privacy program start at some of these companies, and what's the growth of that organization actually look like?
Yeah, so usually if it's a technical company coming up with a technical solution, I'm working with one right now, actually. It's a very small startup. They start with a technical tool. It could be an app, it could be a website. They're developing a solution to help certain kinds of customers, and they have certain clients. And so they usually start with the technical solution, and then they say, hey, we also need to comply with privacy laws because we are processing personal data. Hey, and let's go find a compliance expert who's going to help us with that. It kind of starts there. So usually the technical solution comes first, or the idea or the invention comes first. And then they start to think of, hey, we need to put some seatbelts in here. What are the regs, and who's going to help us with that?
And then does that typically start in-house, or are they usually starting with some sort of like consultant or contractor to help them navigate the regulations to start with as they're sort of just bringing something like that to market?
Yeah. And if we start talking about very small startups, which is really starting with really the equity of the people who are starting the company, and they have no, outside investors, it's usually they go and they typically, and I would use the word in a negative way, but copy what best practice from other companies. They look at privacy notices at similar companies. They start there. And then they say, maybe we need to have this double checked. So they bring in usually a consultant because they can't afford a full-time in-house person. They probably can't even afford an attorney. And so they usually come in with a consultant. But these days, and I will go there later, Sean, but there are certain websites and there are portals where you can obtain a lot of the legal material and tailored to your company's needs. It doesn't solve every need, but you can start there.
What are some of the common misconceptions or misunderstandings about data privacy in the healthcare, health tech world that you often encounter?
Yeah, so healthcare is one of those unique areas where if you are providing health services, that's treatment, payment, operations, HIPAA allows you to process the medical data of patients, provided you meet the HIPAA security and privacy rule requirements, and then you are not that much bound by state law. Now, if you start off as a health and wellness company where you're not covered by HIPAA, you're not a covered entity, you're not a business associate, then you go into a different regime where the FTC is the one who's regulating you, and you are processing personal data. You have to comply with the 50 state laws, and that's sometimes a little bit that companies don't realize that nuance between when and who is regulating them. I think that's one of the common misconceptions.
How is that distinction made? So essentially, if you're under HIPAA, then you're basically regulated by a different body than if you're not under HIPAA. If you're sort of more in the, I believe you said medical device space, then you're going to essentially have to comply with the state level laws. Is that right?
That's correct. So HIPAA is very clear. So you usually, if you're a covered entity, that's you're providing medical treatments like a medical doctor. It could be a lab that's testing your blood. So these are all covered entities, and they need to follow HIPAA. Then you have payers, insurance providers who are also covered under HIPAA because they cover the medical claims. And then the last part is our operations. So treatment, payment, and operations. TPO is how they usually go. These companies and their business associates and the business associates, second and third and fourth level business, they all need to comply with HIPAA. And then there's a last class of companies called healthcare clearing houses, where the data that's transmitted between these entities goes through clearing houses, and they also are covered by HIPAA. Now, sometimes it's not clear whether you're covered by HIPAA. Like, for example, you're a health and wellness company, and you are collecting blood pressure of the patients who have a wearable device that you are deploying. Are you covered by HIPAA? And this is where it gets to be a little tricky, and companies should really consult with the right professional to make that determination. And that's where you may start off, like I said, as a health and wellness company. You're just measuring blood pressure and let's say heart rate, but you're not doing anything with that. You're not making treatment decisions, diagnosis decisions. You're a health and wellness company, so they are not covered by HIPAA. And again, those gray areas are areas that I won't go into in some detail, but that's where sometimes companies trip up.
Yeah. Because even, signing up for a gym membership, they're going to ask you certain sort of your history of healthcare, maybe, heart disease, these types of things. So you're kind of like dipping a toe towards something that potentially you might think of as being regulated by HIPAA.
That's correct. And you can collect that kind of information. It becomes sensitive data or sensitive personal data. But if you're not using it for diagnosis, payment, treatment, then you are not a covered entity. And, but what could end up happening, and these are the tricky areas where, let's say you work with the hospital system, you get some of their patients into your gym, and then you start to collect their data, and then you send that data on to the hospital. Now you may be a business associate of that hospital. You have to be careful, how you essentially be careful what kind of data you're collecting, what are you doing with it, who are you transmitting it to, and then those usually will help you determine what kind of an entity you are and whether you're covered by HIPAA or not.
And then how has the landscape of healthcare data privacy evolved in recent years? And are there sort of new challenges that have emerged as a result of, innovation or new types of investments in this space?
There's been a tremendous transformation, and it's mainly, it just would say started maybe with the smartphones and you got technology into every little space. And then, you have now dozens of companies that were never medical device companies that are now doing very innovative things with their technology, with that technology. And then they start to collect data, even geolocation data, they start to collect, and, it could get implied under, patient privacy and under HIPAA. So all of a sudden, a company that was thinking, I'm just collecting location data, and now you're covered under HIPAA. And that's one of the HIPAA, so-called 18 famous identifiers that you need to now protect. So that's where the challenge starts with technology has taken a leap, with the invention of the smartphone and all the the cloud-based technologies that enable the smartphone to become super powerful. And now you can do a lot with it. You can, Philips at one time used to make these ultrasound machines that used to weigh about 200 kilograms, and they stood like on a desktop with the wheels and so on. These days, Philips just gives you the transducer, the ultrasound transducer, which you can plug into something like a smartphone. And all of a sudden, you have a ultrasound machine in your hand, literally. And those kinds of technological leaps are now followed by collecting data and very sensitive personal data at high volume. And now privacy is now much more important. In the previous case, the ultrasound machine was inside the hospital network. It was locked down, and it was inside a VPN, and it was kind of easy to protect that data, probably connected to an EMR system, but now it's connected to the cloud, and that data can go anywhere.
Yes, it's kind of like comparing, 1980s computing where you're in an office, maybe you're doing something with customer records, but like the data doesn't leave the physical machine that essentially you're working on. So that is a much different problem from a privacy security perspective than essentially doing that at the scale of the cloud where the data is like replicated all over the place, and you have to be thinking about like constantly what are your, ingress and egress places for your customer data and where it's flowing. And you mentioned this, like these challenges around some of these companies that are innovating in the space. And I think one of the things that I've seen as well is that when you're regulated under something like HIPAA or even any type of regulation, you also have to be thinking about like not only the technology that you're developing, but the third-party systems that you're relying on. So if you're regulated under HIPAA and then you're collecting certain types of data, and you're using HubSpot, say, for your marketing automation. Well, HubSpot's not HIPAA compliant. So are you putting regulated data into HubSpot without really like thinking that through? Or what are you doing from your email relay? Some types of email systems are HIPAA compliant and you can send HIPAA compliant emails. Other ones are not. Or, text messaging, all these types of things you have to think through. What are your API integrations or, third-party systems that you're using where you're storing some of this information?
That's correct, Sean. It's not only the technological linkages that you need to worry about, but all the liability that goes with it. Because if you're a covered entity, let's say, and you're using a text messaging provider, and they're sending your text messages for you, if they have a breach, well, you're the covered entity. You have to report that breach to HIPAA, and you have to compensate those patients and potentially liable to fines. So what ends up happening is companies that didn't think through these things, all of a sudden, because of breaches that are happening, are now waking up to that possibility. Their insurance rates are going up through the roof, and they're having to write these ironclad contracts with their providers and enforce those contracts.
Yeah. So when it comes to like the development of drugs and some other forms of care that like directly impact the patient's health, those industries are, highly regulated as they should be by like the FDA. However, I think some of the things that we're talking about here is like traditionally, I think some of the security and privacy in health is not as tightly controlled, or it's, thought of a little bit as an afterthought. Why is that the case in comparison to essentially the regulations that go around, like, bringing a drug to market, for example?
And this is an excellent question. If you think about, let's say, a pharma company that's manufacturing a vaccine, the actual process where the vaccine gets made in a factory is very highly controlled, and it comes under the FDA quality management systems, QSR requirements, and there are European equivalents, etc. Very highly regulated, where every ingredient that goes into that vaccine, it has to meet electronic e-signature, Part 11 compliance controlled, etc. Now, for that same company, the privacy data was not, managed with that same, usually under that same quality management system, because FDA did not govern that. It was more HHS and OCR that were governing the privacy of the customer data, or even physician data that these pharma companies may have. So they were kept separate. But what's now happening is companies are getting into these drug device type of combination, and where it could be a pharma company that's deploying a connected inhaler that's is connected to the cloud, and now the drug and the device are both being controlled by the company. And in those cases, and especially Europe came down very strongly with the regulations, and FDA also, cybersecurity requirements and privacy requirements are forcing these companies to now consider both of them to be under that highly regulated scheme. Maybe they don't put it in the same QMS, some do, and they're seeing the value of putting it into the same QMS because ultimately they are being regulated, and you could not keep them separate anymore once you go to the cloud.
Yeah. And now everything's like getting connected to the cloud. So it's not just about protecting. Now you need to always be thinking, I guess, about protecting the data, because you're probably collecting it and storing it somewhere.
That's correct. And before, the pharma companies, there were two areas where they would have to protect the data. One was in clinical trials. When they ran clinical trials and they gathered the data, they usually kept it in the cloud, and then they had to manage that for FDA submissions requirements. And then the other area is post-market surveillance, where once a drug is released into the market, and there could be adverse events and severe adverse events, and then you need, as a company, you need to scan for those, and you need to also report it to the FDA if you see those adverse events. And so that data was also kept in the cloud. But now it's, like I said, the in-between, something, because clinical trials are done very early, before the product is ever thought of or even cleared for market. And all the way to the end, post-market surveillance happens after an approved drug is in the market. So the in-between is also now becoming part of coming under the regulatory oversight.
Historically, how do like pharma and drug companies like manage and secure personal data for some of these things, like a trial? Is it private? Like how do they make sure essentially no abuse scenarios happening within the company? Is it primarily sort of like policy based, or are they using technology to help control some of that?
Yeah, so it has traditionally been, and now I'm talking more than 10 years ago, they were, when they conducted clinical trials, they would go to a hospital, enroll patients in the clinical trial, and then that data that was collected was sometimes collected even by the hospital, the clinicians, the principal investigators in the hospitals, and then they were de-identified and given to the pharma or med device companies. So now, because the rapid pace, again, because of new product development, both device and drugs are being constantly innovated, and the clinical trials, and if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, that's the website where all clinical trials are registered, you see hundreds, thousands of clinical trials out there. And at that volume, now the roles have changed. So usually pharma or device companies may outsource it to a CRO, clinical research organization, to do that work for them, gathering that data and then, basically de-identifying it or even anonymizing it or pseudonymizing it and then giving it back. Some companies will do it by themselves, but because it's become such a specialized space, more of them use CROs these days. But again, it depends on the company.
Okay, I see. And then I guess if you're, trying to do this yourself, you might not have the specialization, and it's probably going to become a bit of a barrier to your innovation and speed of market for whatever it is that you are actually as you're specialist in.
Yeah, I think, all these companies are realizing more and more that to be specialized in everything is very hard. So you can invent a drug, you can do the clinical work, you can, come up with a drug that now you want to test in a clinical trial, but you're usually not the expert in managing the data that comes out of a clinical trial. So why don't you give it to someone who's an expert in that? And because otherwise you incur a lot of expense and risk, and that usually doesn't pay off. Why should a pharma company become a data company? However, it's always a mix. Sometimes very early trials, early data, like preclinical, where you're testing on animals, you may just do it in-house because that's animal data. But then once you start to go to personal data, and if you go to especially a multi-site clinical trial in multiple countries, managing that data becomes that much harder to do in the conventional way.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can companies, working in the healthcare space or, innovating it with med devices and health tech, build trust and transparency with, the patients or the data subjects of their particular, software or tool or whatever it is that they're developing?
Yeah. It starts with, the privacy notice and what you project outside the company as to what you're going to do with the data. Now, if you enroll patients in a clinical trial, there's usually about a 10-page, sometimes 20-page informed consent form that goes through everything according to the ISO standard. They need to give the purpose of the trial, what are you going to do with the data, what are the risks to the patients, all of that. So it's very detailed, and it informs the patient as to what data is going to be collected, why is it being collected, who is it being sent to, and what they can do, what the company is going to do with the data. The same is not true when you're talking about, let's say, a device company that, let's say a startup that now says, I'm going to I have a beautiful new device that can measure heart rate, with a remote camera, for instance, and then they could deploy it as an app. Now, how do you convey to the patient the same type of information? Why are you collecting the data? What's your objective? What are you going to do with it? And do it in a way that the patient can understand. Because as you know, we get on the smartphone, we get a click-through agreement, which may be 20 or even 50 pages long, but no one really reads it. And that's where I think companies can sometimes involuntarily, even I would say, I wouldn't use the word deceive, but they could not inform the patient or the customer to the level that they should be doing. And that misconception, that misunderstanding, the patient thinks that this is being collected, but indeed something else is being collected and something else is happening with their data, and they find out afterward, that leads to loss of trust.
I feel like in the non-healthcare world over the last few years, there's, from a consumer standpoint, there's more awareness of sort of your personal rights when it comes to your data, and also more paranoia about how companies are, using or abusing your data, probably because of, I think there's, been a lot more noise about that made in the news and more fines doled out. Do you think that you're seeing something similar when it comes to, patients in the healthcare world? Are they more sort of conscious of how somebody might be whether it's a med device company or something like that, might be using their data and are more aware of the potential abuse that could happen there?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is where, I think of the different types of patients we have over there. Some of the patients are just want to get their treatment done. And it's almost like they realize some data is being collected, but they're not so worried about it. I almost put them in that bucket of, I don't care what you do. I trust the company. They're going to do the right thing kind of patients. And then at the other extreme, you have the privacy hawks who are really worried about what is going to happen with their data, what the company can do with it. And Sean, the companies really, it's the world of, where it's a cycle. When the companies start up, they collect a whole bunch of data. Then a lot of companies don't make it past Series A, B, C funding. They close. What happens to that data? And there is good reason for these privacy hawks to be worried, because many companies may not even flush the data or safely delete the data. They may, inadvertently release it, or they may transfer it to a company in an M&A type of situation. So, it's good reason to be worried but having said that, and especially in genetic testing, there are these, and I won't mention the names, but you have the commercial genetic testing companies that check your ancestry and help you with connecting you with, maybe people who may be related to you or not, and a lot of people allow their genetic data to be processed by those companies, and they don't really worry about what that data could be used for, other purposes. And most recently at GeneDx, it's the opposite, where, we are using the genetic data to provide diagnosis that can be used by a physician to provide treatments. So we have been, really very careful with that data and providing the right informed consent and et cetera as to what's happening with that data. So I think in that whole spectrum, both from the company side and the patient side, you have these buckets of companies that are highly regulated. They have to deal with the data in a particular way, and companies that are not that highly regulated, and they can be more laissez-faire with the data, and then on the patient side as well.
Yeah, I really like your point about the company that is a startup, Series A, B, C, or whatever, that goes out of business. There's probably a lot of sensitive data that's sitting in a basically unused, dead AWS database out there right now that someone's basically keeping the lights on, but it's just kind of sitting there dormant. Who knows where my information might be? There's I think a tricky imbalance of power somewhat in the space of healthcare, because if you're a patient and you're sick, or your child's sick or something like that, you want to trust the system, trust the people involved that they're doing everything the right way and get better. And you might not be, essentially the treatment of your data is probably not the number one thing that you're thinking about. You're thinking more about the treatment of me as a person, or the treatment of my family member as a person. So I think that is where things get very complicated, just from an ethics standpoint, and why trust is so key for any of these companies, and maintaining that trust is really, really important. So that really, in order to do that, you need to be prioritizing how you're actually not only ensuring patient safety, but protecting their data as well.
So now, if you think of the more traditional doctor-patient type of relationship, right, a medical doctor and seeing a patient, in the old days, right, there were no machines, there were no electronic storage, and the case records were written on paper. All that has changed. The world has changed. And now there are a lot of companies in between, right? So the EMR provider, the HR providers, the cloud company that's storing that data, and there are companies that transmit that data and receive. So there are a whole bunch of companies that are now involved in that simple doctor-patient relationship. And so I think from the doctor's perspective and the patient's perspective, it's all transparent to them, but something could go wrong in anywhere in that chain. And then now you may have a breach. So I think, you're right in saying that the companies should take that responsibility very seriously, because they may, like a networking company, which is just providing the network that transmits the data from the doctor's office to the cloud, may not be realizing it's sensitive patient data going through, but they are part of that chain. And I think, this is an area that HHS is very interested in making sure that all the companies in the chain realize that responsibility. And breaches these days, a lot of them happen with those downstream service providers, not necessarily with the company at the top.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's not even the main, storage location for the data. It could be like a log file or something like that. It's just like unprotected, or some data that someone copied into, an S3 bucket or something like that for doing some sort of analysis. It might not be necessarily where you naturally are thinking about the location of the data being stored. How does Gen AI play a role in this space? There's a lot of work going on right now and with drug discovery companies leveraging generative AI to help discover new types of molecules. There's also companies I've heard about leveraging doctors' notes to train LLMs. So how do you kind of think about, or what are you seeing, I guess, in the market when it comes to essentially the privacy concerns and regulations?
Yeah. So, and I think when we talk about data that's used for Gen AI, there is the training data for the large language model algorithms, and then there's the actual data that's used when the LLM is deployed in let's say, a doctor's practice, right? So, when you think about how, say, Google or Microsoft or one of the AI companies is having to deal with it, there is data that belongs to the client. That could be the hospital. That is the training data. They have to keep that separate from the other data that's used to generally train the LLM. So they're now talking about business associate agreements and firewalls which allow the training data to be kept separate, the client training data, because it also becomes IP, right? It's the IP of the hospital, and that training data that was used to train that LLM is successful for that hospital. It becomes a competitive advantage that they don't want to give it to their competitor. So they want to keep that data separate as well. So when you think about, you asked, how do you think about this data? You think about the training data, you think about the production data, you think about firewalling it and having business associate agreements around it to prevent that it gets either contaminated, because if there is noise in that data, you get a noisy result, then you could potentially harm patients. So the data cannot be corrupted, but also it's IP. It's very valuable. Once you've trained an LLM, it takes maybe many hours and lots of manpower to do it. You put a lot of money into that training. So you want to protect it. So I think from a privacy perspective, it's not so easy. Like in the old days, you could say, here's data, let's just encrypt it, and then it's safe. But in AI, it's not going to be that, right? Because data is going to be encrypted by default. The breach is not going to be that much of a concern. But in terms of, that having that boundary, virtual boundary where a particular hospital's data is corralled and used for the purpose of that particular hospital and its patients, I think that's where we're going to see some new paradigms.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to think through from essentially the collection of what you're going to be doing for your training data. And then how do you protect that at rest, who has access to it? How do you feed that into an LLM for training or augmenting in a way that, you're not leaking sensitive data into the LLM? And then how do you control essentially access to the responses from the LLM during inference so that only the right people are seeing the right types of responses based on, who they are? There's a lot of new, I think, problems to try to solve and navigate here in a space that's moving very, very fast from a technology standpoint.
That's true. And the other thing there was I was talking to a colleague recently about, one area that has been, things have been successfully deployed is natural language understanding, where, doctors' notes and nurses' notes have to be, for many purposes, from either for a pharma company, med device company, hospital, they want to digitize, notes, free text notes. And that you would think is a natural thing for a Gen AI, but it isn't. Why? Because, the doctors use these shortcuts. They use these references. They use these shorthand, and it's really hard for, I'm sure Gen AI will catch up eventually, but it's still, the human transcription of those notes is superior to the Gen AI.
And I would think too that even if you were using like a OCR scanner on a doctor's note, then you need to think about, is that OCR scanner HIPAA compliant? If it's storing any of that data or processing that data and stuff, which you'd also have to kind of think through, because it probably, an off-the-shelf OCR is probably not designed for doing something as sensitive as, recognizing a doctor's note.
Well, that has been a problem that's been more easily solved because it goes into a printer, scanner, and then it gets scanned in, and then it's converted into a PDF or whatever, so that it can be encrypted and transmitted, and that's been solved. But what's not been solved is the handwriting itself. We all know how a doctor's handwriting is notorious for being not so legible or not so understandable. And how do you convert that into structured text, that correctly? Because if you make mistakes, remember, you could harm a patient. Once you use that high standard, then everything that you do takes on a new level of complexity.
Yeah. I mean, even, misreading the dosage on a drug that's in handwritten could lead to really, really, terrible consequences. So essentially the precision and accuracy on a reader like that has to be very, very high, way above what I think a human would be capable of.
That's true. And don't forget that the data entry itself could be noisy, right? A nurse who takes blood pressure may put 260 over there when they really were talking about 160, and that's noisy data, and it's not the algorithm screwing up, but the data that went in is also noisy. So I think this is where humans seeing that piece of data is going to say, well, someone with a 260 blood pressure should be taken to the hospital right away. But it doesn't seem right for this otherwise healthy person. A human doctor would immediately know that's an error. And but a machine, yeah, this is where I think it's going to be. And same thing we're seeing with self-driving cars, right? What seems pretty easy for a human driver is pretty hard for a self-driving.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's the future look like for companies in the space? Like if you were advising a company today, what would your suggestions be around tackling some of the compliance and data privacy challenges?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of tools deployed, and you have to be careful. And we talk about privacy enhancing technologies. We're talking about automated ways of looking for sensitive data, and then recognizing that it's sensitive data, processing it, and then preventing humans or machines from making mistakes, and how to put technical controls around it. And I liken this to a seatbelt, right? So I like the seatbelt analogy because, it's an easy to use tool that makes the occupants of the car safe. When they buckle in, they're factor of magnitude more safe than when they're unbuckled. However, firstly, people in the old days would forget to wear their seatbelts or purposely not wear their seatbelt. And there's no way to really fix that. There's no way to confirm that they've really put the seatbelt around them and not under them. So I think this is where technology has to come in and be more ubiquitous, and the right technology in the right place can help to put these controls in place so that they cannot be circumvented. And I think that's the way in which to make things safer, build trust and build transparency.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I think that there's a ton of like greenfield opportunities for people who are, technology leaders to innovate in the space. Like even if you think about the data space outside of healthcare, there's so much innovation that exists around like data observability tools, companies like Monte Carlo that can essentially monitor your warehouse to make sure that the data is like consistent based on prior history of data, so they can essentially automatically identify flaws in the data, which made me, that sounds kind of similar to some of the things you were talking about where, a human doctor is going to recognize that blood pressure at 260 is, maybe not the right thing. There was some sort of transcription issue. There's a lot of, I think, opportunity to leverage AI and some of the things that we've done in other areas within the health care space. Of course, the problems are much more difficult there because the consequences of mistakes is very, very high. But I feel like that's where the future is probably going in this world.
Yeah, definitely so. And I think with the advent of Gen AI, you're going to actually see more compliance people, humans, because it may displace some of the technical people, right? You don't need maybe as many software developers, but I think you're going to need more people reviewing what the AI is doing, and with quality assurance and compliance people. I believe there's going to be a bigger market for them.
Yeah, you're going to need some human in the loop component to anything that you're probably doing around AI in the space. As we start to wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to share? Any thoughts that or is there topics that maybe we didn't get a chance to touch on?
I think this is such an open area. We could go on forever, Sean. It's been such a pleasant conversation with you. Thank you for this opportunity. I think the thing that I think we should always keep in focus is the patient or the customer, or because they are not usually as up to date on what technology is doing for them, and sometimes there are as misconceptions, and sometimes there's even misinformation that is generated that can really defeat even companies that are trying to be very trusted and transparent can be that can be upended with the misinformation, a campaign of misinformation. So I think this is an area that where we in the privacy business have to really keep that customer and explain things at the level that they understand, and keep it simple, keep it transparent, and be open. And you can't anymore have a 500-page privacy policy. I don't think people are going to put up with that. But then the downside is that for a company that does indulge in those kinds of practices, they're just going to see their clients go away. So I think, and I really sincerely believe that, technology can help, but it has to be done in a very trusted and transparent way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Murali, thanks so much for being here. The pleasure's all mine. I really enjoyed this conversation. Love to have you back down the road. I'm sure we can tackle another topic. Like you said, I think we could go on for a really long time diving into this world. There's so much to talk about. But thanks so much for being here. And I learned a ton, and I think the audience will also learn a ton.
Thank you, Sean. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.